Welcome to How to Fix It. I'm John Avlon, author, journalist, historian. And the purpose of this podcast is to focus on finding solutions to the problems we face, not simply fixating on the problems themselves. Lord knows we got a lot of them right now, particularly in the realm of geopolitics. We have America siding with authoritarian governments over our democratic allies. We have the subversion of broad support for free and fair trade in favor of a protectionist regime, which promises to inflame the affordability crisis at the time when it needs more alleviating. And we've got major issues coming down the pike like TikTok and whether or not Beijing will keep it the back end and its algorithmic influence over Americans. Joining me to discuss this and much more, including what Americans can do to send messages to our allies, how we can build a patriotic civil society response against authoritarian power grabs, is Kori Schake. Kori is a classic Reagan, Bush, McCain Republican. She is the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. She has served at the U.S. Department of Defense, State Department, and National Security Council. And we are honored to have her join us here on How to Fix It. Kori, welcome to How to Fix It.
It is such a pleasure, my friend.
How do you understand how your party, the Republican Party, has abandoned its principles almost on a dime as it comes to really big things like siding with democracies versus autocracies, free trade versus protectionism?
Yeah, I don't have a good solution to that, John, but my explanation of the trajectory is, as you mentioned, I sailed on the pirate ship McCain in 2008, and a lot of the reckless destruction I see the Trump administration enacting feels like a continuity from Sarah Palin, from the Tea Party, from even tracing back to Ronald Reagan in the 80s, saying government isn't the solution, it's the problem. I think the expansion of American government into so many aspects of people's lives made people on the right politically begin to think that it was out of control and there was no way to control it. That's the only explanation I can think of that makes any sense for the way so many people around President Trump are validating willfully destructive behaviors. I mean, we're gonna delegitimize conservatism for a generation the way we are going in members of Congress and conservatives in the public supporting choices by the president.
The obvious note, the last time I checked, autocracies are the most oppressive form of government, not the least. But let's focus on free trade, because that's very much in the news this week. President Trump announcing widespread blanket tariffs on our allies as well as our enemies. Obviously, we've seen this with his obsessive assault on the world's most peaceful border with our neighbor Canada. It's totally contradictory to the stated aims of this administration during the campaign. Tariffs are taxes. They will raise prices on hardworking families. They'll inflame the affordability crisis. But from a geopolitical and geostrategic standpoint, already we've seen China begin to hold trade talks with America's traditional allies in the region, Japan and South Korea. What does that tell you?
It tells me that the tariff strategy is self-defeating and not only has damaging economic effects, but has damaging geopolitical effects. Americans will be less secure if we alienate the friends who help us maintain our security and prosperity.
We seem to be an unreliable ally, but for China, it takes a lot for Japan and South Korea to start trade talks with China. I mean, that is something that's totally contrary to their interests and recent history, if you define recent by, 3/4 of the century.
Yeah, so I have two reactions to that, John. The first is, you're exactly right. We'll be lucky if this tariff policy by the Trump administration doesn't result in the countries of the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, including China, in a multilateral trade initiative the United States initiated under President Bush to bring 12 countries on the Pacific Rim into agreed market access, labor, and environmental standards and exclude China. So the first thing is this is likely to result not just with bilateral trade initiatives by American allies, but the inclusion of China in a major multilateral trade pact that will disadvantage American businesses. And the second thing I would say is we cannot manage the problems China is creating militarily, economically, politically, without enormous assistance from countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and America's allies in Europe and North America. And we are losing that at an remarkable rate of speed because of the behavior of the Trump administration, not just the tariffs, the ugliness about invading Canada and making it a 51st state. That kind of stuff is genuinely damaging to the security of our country.
Ugliness is too polite, sheer insanity. I would ask people to undergo the most obvious of thought experiments. What if there was a Canadian prime minister who was talking about colonizing and invading the United States? Yes, it would be laughable, but it would also be regarded as utterly insane.
It's even bad strategy on the terms the Trump administration is grading itself, because they have made possible the re-election of Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party in Canada under Mark Carney as prime minister. 3 months ago, they were down by 25 points, and now they are very likely to win the election. So Trump's behavior has enabled the election of a government hostile to the United States.
The larger geostrategic stakes, the quote unquote logic of these illogical actions, it seems to me, and I want to get your take on this, is some sort of a conceptual framework, Monroe Doctrine, across the globe, where in effect China gets its sphere of influence in Asia, Russia gets Europe. I mean, Curtis Yarvin, one of the vice president's most admired individuals, said the other day that his new foreign policy idea is that we ought to give Russia a free hand in Europe, with all the implications that means for NATO and Ukraine. And then presumably the U.S. gets North America, which helps explain the sort of Greenland, Canada to Panama fixation. Do you think that's credible? And then more importantly, what do we do about it? We being the vast majority of the American people who recognize this is not in our interests or in our traditions, and our allies to recognize that we doubled down on this mistake as a nation, but it's only 4 years and it's out. It's not popular, nor is it sustainable or sane.
Yeah, those are great challenges. I mean, there are two severe problems with Trump administration strategy. The first is that they don't seem to realize how much American soft power enables and reduces the cost of what America tries to do in the world. I mean, people are booing the national anthem America's national anthem in Canada. And we won the geopolitical lottery by having Canada and Mexico as our neighbors. Trump's strategy is destroying that, acting as though that won't increase the difficulty of everything else we try and do in the world. And the second big problem with their strategy is it assumes that nobody but us has agency. That is, if we abandon Europe, they will have no choice but to do exactly what we wanted them to do. And my experience as a coalition manager since 1995 in my government jobs is that when the United States steps back, everybody else steps back further, except the bad guys. And that without an American commitment, our closest friends, the countries who help us fight our wars, who invest in our economy, who work with us to shape the order to make it safe and prosperous, those countries don't have the confidence to make brave choices without our help. And so they will make choices bad for us and bad for them because they lack confidence that without our assistance, they can hold their own against the bad guys.
NATO, an institution of America and our allies making, based on the hard-won lessons of World War II, is the world's most successful international alliance, peacekeeping alliance at the end of the day. When you talk to individuals in NATO or our allies in the Five Eyes, who we share intelligence information with, what is their attitude towards dealing with the Trump administration? Are they gaining hope that there is a post-Trumpian future that will return to something resembling normal, or has trust been broken in profound ways we are going to have to fix over a generation?
I think trust has been broken. You know, in the first Trump term, Europeans and our friends elsewhere in the world were trying not to add to the chaos. They were biding their time and trusting in the good judgment of the American people. The re-election of President Trump has caused America's allies to believe this is a redirection driven by the United States. And they are heartsick to think that not only are we not their security guarantee, their friends, but that we have actually joined the axis of bad guys, that we are actively working against their interests. And every time Vice President Vance opens his mouth, he reaffirms that fear on the part of America's allies. And so they are taking small but irrevocable steps to build their own security and protect themselves from us economically and in security terms. And exactly as you say, John, it will take a generation to repair this damage, if we even can.
So the folks who voted for Donald Trump because maybe they were pissed off about elements of wokeism or the impacts of inflation have unleashed an unimaginable amount of destruction in what has been rightly called the free world. And they own it. But there is the Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you buy it. We have a responsibility to fix it. What's the right response from a civil society's perspective to patriotically protest constructively, to check and balance these power grabs that are designed to destroy, not build, on the part of the administration geostrategically, and to send a message to our allies that this speaks to a radical faction of Americans that is temporarily in power. It does not speak to American interests, traditions, or opinion.
Yeah, so I love the definition of patriotism that Major General Carl Schurz from the Union Army during the American Civil War posited.
Yeah.
And he was a German American and had his loyalty to the country challenged by somebody who said, America, right or wrong? And Schurz's response to that was, my country, right or wrong? When right, to be kept right. When wrong, to be put right. And that is the challenge for American civil society right now, which is to use our voices to tell America's friends in the world and America's government, you don't speak for me in these actions, right? What has unbalanced the American political system so much is Congress failing to exercise its Article I authorities from the Constitution. And what will cause Congress to act against, a Republican majority Congress to act against a Republican president is fear of losing a Republican majority Congress. Right? And so the self-interest of politicians of my party right now, they are fearful that they cannot cross President Trump and his supporters. And our challenge as civil society is to prove that wrong, to show up and to call or show up at congressional offices and say, what are you guys doing? This isn't good for the country. It's spiking inflation. It's making everything we want to do in the world harder. Come on, guys, make better choices. because changing congressional support for the president will restrict his freedom of action and send an important signal to America's friends around the world that the distribution of power in the American system can be a force for good.
It can be, it should be. Redistricting, that rigged system, and a culture that has elevated self-interest over the national interest, party over country. These all things have corroded our moral character and those of our elected representatives. And yes, they are to some extent rationally self-interested, except for the fact they keep undercutting the power of their own institution. It's really cowardly, and they got to be called out on it, and they need to be confronted, but it needs to be done in a patriotic way.
Good people like you need to run for office, and I hope you will again, my friend.
Thank you, Corey. I appreciate that. So that's what U.S. citizens should do. What are you hearing NATO's response to this is? I mean, here you get the administration effectively siding with Russia. They haven't been subtle about that. Before this election, Trump had talked about effectively, why would we want to support a small country if it were invaded by Russia, basically mocking and undercutting Article 5. What is from a geostrategic standpoint, what is the rational response for NATO if America is an unreliable ally?
If I were the national security advisor of any government allied to the United States, I would consider the Trump administration an unreliable security partner. And I would be frantically doing the analysis to figure out where is the security and prosperity of my country reliant on the United States, and how do I build up our resilience to American abandonment. And you can see countries already doing this. You use the example of South Korea and Japan beginning to negotiate trade with China. I think the European Union is likely to respond very forcefully to the imposition of tariffs. To the extent American allies can cooperate and present a united front to the Trump administration, to the U.S. under the Trump administration, that minimizes American leverage, and it demonstrates that these countries are powerful, and when they band together, they can actually prevent the United States from achieving its objectives.
That's sobering perspective. And I do hope that they find enough value in the existing institutions to maintain them in our temporary absence, in effect. Let's talk about TikTok, because that's an aspect of this. I mean, people, I think, have overlooked the fact that the day before Trump was inaugurated, he effectively set the signal that he was going to ignore a 9-0 Supreme Court decision and a congressional law, not only compelling the sale or shutting down of TikTok, but also that its back-end algorithm would not be controlled by Beijing. Now, that decision, the administration's self-imposed extension and decision, which again is in violation of congressional law and Supreme Court order, is coming due in the coming days. We will learn more details. But there are indications that while the ownership and superficial oversight might change to an American company, the back end will still be controlled by Beijing. What do you think of that in terms of its security risks and its intelligence risks?
I think it absolutely does not alleviate the security risks of 190 million Americans being on TikTok. So there are two categories of concerns about TikTok. The first is the amassing of American data onto Chinese servers, because no Chinese company is exempt from their national security law that requires Chinese government access to that data. So we are handing over an enormous swath of data on the part of Americans to a hostile government. The second concern about TikTok is that the Chinese government will restrict information in ways that advantage Chinese policy, or use it as a tool in American domestic politics. And right before the congressional legislation passed, TikTok actually tried to do that. They used the data that they have on American TikTok users to send a message to them with their specific member of Congress and that member of Congress's telephone number, and encouraged Americans to oppose that legislation. That is exactly why China controlling the algorithm should be a non-starter. And it's genuinely shocking. I share your shock that the president is not only ignoring legislation, he's ignoring a Supreme Court verdict. This is a very dangerous undercutting of the rule of law in the United States.
How do you fix that? If the administration decides to award TikTok, in effect, to some sort of allied or administration adjacent company, but Beijing keeps the back end. I want to keep underlining that. That is a total violation of the law that Congress, including Republicans, passed. That is a violation of the Supreme Court. And it's a violation of American sovereignty, in effect, because of the disinformation potential that's not being addressed. So what do you do about that?
So a smart policy would have been, from the moment that congressional law passed, for the president of either party to have convened potential American buyers and tried to persuade them to make a good offer to China for complete takeover. I doubt China would have taken that, but having established a good faith effort, the president could go back to American users of TikTok and say, we need an American alternative to this. And perhaps it would have been useful to incentivize American companies to prioritize producing a TikTok-like social media platform that Americans could switch over to when the law took effect. The Trump administration also could have used these last 3 months to do that, but I don't think they are. I think what they are doing is...
You don't think?
Yeah. What they are doing is setting up a continuation of TikTok's operation in the United States under a fig leaf of control over the data that won't work in practice.
That appears to be the case. And I hope it is not, because this is how you normalize ignoring Congress, courts, and American interests. And how many Trump supporters are fixated on the dangers of China, as they say it, and yet they are creating a Trojan horse capacity that will no doubt be further used, among other things, to reduce faith in democracy itself. Let's talk about the nature of our democracy vis-a-vis civilian-military relations. It is a hallmark of our country, and for good reasons. The founders set up separation of powers of all sorts, from church and state to civilian and military, because they were drawing on the lessons of other countries, of history, of how democracies have been undermined. We've seen the troubling firing of generals by the Secretary of Defense. And this past week, we heard a hearing for the new nominee to confirm Lieutenant General Dan Kane as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. What stood out to you about those hearings, and what are you hearing about the hearings, as it were?
Yeah, so to start with the firing of General C.Q. Brown as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other senior officers, that is ill-judged because he was doing a good job. But it's important in the American system that the president can fire anybody in the military leadership. That actually really matters for the subordination of the American military. It is historically anomalous to have a military this powerful, this respected, this influential in policymaking that does not become a threat to civilian power. And the American military has never been a threat to civilian power in 250 years. So it's a legacy to treasure. I was pretty impressed with how General Kane handled his confirmation hearings, because the only question that was going to matter was, did you say it? Did you do it? As the president claimed, General Kane had put on a MAGA hat and said, I love you, I die for you. General Kane was asked that right off the bat by the chairman of Senate Armed Services, and he denied that he had done that. And I think that was very important, because the politicization of the military is something President Trump and the people around him are working very hard to embolden. The American military should be inert in politics. And the way that General Kane answered questions, for example, about the signal debacle of senior cabinet officials leaking classified information onto unclassified commercial platforms. He got asked what he would, whether he thought he should have been involved in that. And he very adroitly, he avoided saying the director of Central Intelligence is a liar and should be fired. But what he did say was, I wouldn't have done that. And that looked to me like a political conversation that the military shouldn't be involved in. So he kept the military a step back from things that politicians, even well-meaning politicians, want to draw the military into. So I think he's off to a good start.
So that's a hopeful thing. I think the danger, obviously, is that the Trump appointees have sort of normalized lying in the context of their hearings. So you have to rely to extent on the character of the individual, which is presumably reflected in their record. But you have faith, despite the fact that Kane seems to have been selected. Maybe you have some insights into how he was selected, but he seems to have been selected out of retirement because at least some people on the Trump team think he is on their team. But do you have reason to think he is more independent than that?
Well, I think he is both more professional than that and more cognizant of the damage it would do to the American military for the public to believe that. So he has told people privately, I haven't talked to him, he has told people privately that the story wasn't true. Also, that while he did interview with the Trump team, he was astonished to find out he was being selected as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because he doesn't meet the statutory requirements of having been a service chief or a combatant commander. And he was a 3-star general, not a 4-star general. So he understands the risks that the corrosion of good order and discipline that the Trump administration is attempting to impose. He understands how damaging that would be.
A lot depends in an era where guardrails are removed on the integrity of a very small number of individuals. And perhaps it's always been that way. In a democracy, we've just taken it for granted. As you look at the politicization of organizations related to law and order and national security writ large, Kash Patel at FBI appointing Dan Bongino deputy director, Pete Hegseth coming from a Fox Weekend News host to being Secretary of Defense. How concerned are you that not just the top level appointments, but the secondarily level appointments, I can add Tulsi Gabbard to that list, are setting up a structure which seems primed to politicize organizations which cannot be politicized and could not only undermine trust in our system, but help move along a constitutional crisis. And in the case of that, what do we do? What do you do? What do Republican national officials do to help depolarize that situation and create a little bit broader awareness of the urgency outside partisan politics?
So I share your concern. I do think we are in very dangerous territory. And it appears to me the clear intention of the president and the people around him, not just to break the law, but to break the Constitution in order to accomplish what they are seeking to do. And what Americans, I mean, we have an advantage over many other societies that have seen authoritarian challenges like this materialize, in that the distribution of powers in the American system is so widespread that there are lots more countervailing forces that can be brought to bear. For example, in addition to the American military, there are National Guard under state authority and under governor's control that are a counterbalance against the potential use of the military in domestic circumstances. And there are checks and balances all over the American system. Contribute to strengthening those forces. Complain to your members of Congress, show up in support of people who are being treated illegally, bear witness to what's happening. I mean, I think it would be very dangerous for people to interpose themselves if, for example, as is happening on college campuses, people are being spirited away by security forces. But everybody's got a telephone, everybody's got social media access. Bear witness. That really matters in restraining illegal and unconstitutional behavior.
Bear witness. Be not afraid. Corey Shackey, thank you very much for joining us on How to Fix It.